The large Hoole estate had been bustling since morning. Countless workers were preparing the grounds for the wedding ceremony. Florists were decorating tables with white roses, and waiters were unfolding tablecloths. Everything was going according to plan. Derek Hoole, the young groom, walked nervously past the floral arches, avoiding the bustle. His head was full of thoughts of the upcoming event, but he tried to stay calm. Alexis Garner, his fiancée, seemed the epitome of calm. She strolled among the guests in her morning gown, smiling demurely and accepting compliments about the upcoming ceremony. There was not a shadow of excitement on her face, though many of her bridesmaids were worried about her, torn between making preparations and discussing the details of the festivities. Derek's father, Michael Hoole, had been on site from the beginning. He oversaw the process with the importance of a man who was used to everything having to be perfect. Michael was a solid businessman who had long earned respect in the community. He gave instructions to his employees and occasionally made jokes to lighten the mood. However, not all of his jokes seemed harmless. Michael occasionally held Alexis's gaze longer than necessary. He'd come closer to her under the pretense of organizational matters, adjust something in the decor next to her, and casually make jokes that could have been perceived as friendly, but clearly had an undercurrent. Alexis smiled back, as if not noticing the innuendo. Her return glances, brief but heartfelt, did not go unnoticed, however. Clara Howell, Derek's mother, watched the commotion with slight concern. Her son was a grown man preparing for the most important event of his life. She wanted this day to be perfect, but something was keeping her on edge. Oddly enough, it wasn't problems with the organization or even the behavior of the guests. It was Michael's glances at his daughter-in-law that alarmed her. Clara had long ago noticed those brief moments when their gazes crossed. It seemed to her that it was just a silly game, typical of men trying to hold on to their attraction. She banished those thoughts, convincing herself that it was just harmless flirting, and went on with her preparations. The wedding day promised to be bright and sunny. Waiters were setting up tables under huge awnings, menus laid out sparkling with the gold embossing of the newlyweds' names. Guests arrived one by one, and each carried with them a sense of joy and anticipation. It was impossible to imagine that behind this perfect picture there was more than just preparations for the wedding feast. "Clara, have you seen the floral arrangements?" Michael turned to her, coming too close to discuss another detail of the decor. "I think they overpower the center of the table a little." "I trust the florists," she replied, trying not to seem embarrassed by his attention to such details. He'd never been so meticulous about the small details of a party before. "Well, maybe I'm just too worried about our boy," Michael said with a smile, glancing at Alexis, who was laughing with her friends. Clara couldn't help but notice the look, but she tried not to pay it any mind. Perhaps it was just her imagination. After all, today was an important day for the whole family. Meanwhile, Alexis continued her leisurely stroll through the garden. With each step, she seemed to draw attention to herself like a magnet. Her elegance and ease delighted all the guests. Men furtively glanced at her, and women discussed her perfect outfit. But only one man allowed himself to look at her so openly and brazenly: Michael. All the while, Derek was consumed with the organization. It seemed to him that it was his responsibility to oversee every little detail to make this day special for Alexis. He hadn't noticed his father approaching his future wife more and more, nor had he noticed Alexis herself becoming a little more relaxed with him. "Can you help me?" Alexis suddenly asked Michael when he approached her again. There was a tone in her voice that could have been mistaken for friendly, but an attentive ear would have picked up something more. Michael gave her a glance, too slow and assessing, before helping her to adjust the light shawl around her shoulders. Clara was passing by at that moment and froze for a moment. Her gaze stopped on their hands, which lingered on each other a little longer than they should have. Her heart pricked with anxiety, but she immediately pushed the thought away. "It's just nerves," she convinced herself. All day long there was a festive bustle all around, which gradually drew everyone into the holiday atmosphere. Close friends and distant relatives chatted, laughed, exchanged congratulations with the newlyweds. Clara tried to be the center of attention, as befitted the mother of the groom, but she constantly felt something subtly unsettling, especially when Michael was near Alexis. Alexis herself acted like a true bride. engaging, joyful, but her demeanor was a little more flirtatious than usual. She wasn't shy about throwing smiles at Michael, and while that could be put down to her cheerful nature, Clara could no longer ignore that subtle undercurrent of tension that ran between her husband and sister-in-law. But for now, things looked innocent, and she decided not to delve into it. Eventually, it was time for the pre-wedding dinner. The guests were seated at long tables under awnings, and waiters were serving the food. Michael found himself standing next to Alexis in one of the celebratory photos taken by a photographer. It seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. Father next to daughter-in-law, congratulations, smiles. Clara looked at the scene, and despite a slight sense of unease, she continued to smile. Derek, meanwhile, was toasting his parents and his future wife. His voice sounded loud and confident, and the guests laughed and applauded. Everything was going according to plan, as it should at a wedding reception. The festivities continued in the same spirit, with toasts, laughter, and merriment. The ceremony began in the early afternoon. The sun was already high above the horizon, illuminating with bright rays the snow-white arches covered with flowers. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, watched the newlyweds' every move with smiles. Alexis, in a dazzling white dress, walked toward Derek with confidence and ease, as if the bustle of the festivities were her natural environment. Derek, waiting for her at the altar, looked excited. His gaze, full of delight and happiness, was fixed on his bride. He couldn't look away from her as she approached. As their gazes met, you could feel the charge of the love they shared in the air. The ceremony was flawless, just as the newlyweds had dreamed of. Michael, the father of the groom, stood next to Clara. He smiled slightly as he watched the ceremony unfold. At first glance, he looked calm and proud of his son, but those who watched him more closely could notice his glances occasionally falling on the bride. Alexis, responding to those glances, would occasionally raise her eyebrows slightly, or cast a brief, barely perceptible glance back. Everything happened so quickly and fleetingly that none of the guests would have suspected anything amiss. When Alexis and Derek exchanged vows and the priest said the words, "You are now husband and wife," the guests burst into applause. The ringing laughter spread throughout the garden, and from that moment the real celebration began. The bride and groom received congratulations from family and friends, took endless pictures, and accepted gifts. Michael moved closer to the newlyweds, congratulated his son, hugged him, and then kissed Alexis on the cheek, holding his hand a little longer than would have been appropriate. No one noticed this except Clara, who stood a little farther away. She watched her husband's every movement and sensed that these small gestures were becoming more and more overt. But so far they didn't go beyond what might have seemed like a father's normal joy. After the ceremony, the guests began to flock to the banquet area. Waiters were serving champagne, and musicians were playing a light jazz tune. Alexis and Derek looked happy, surrounded by friends who kept wishing them happiness in their new lives. Beyond the banquet area in the backyard of the estate was a small shooting range. This entertainment was organized by Michael especially for the guests, a hobby of his youth, which he decided to carry over to his son's party. Everyone could shoot at targets under the supervision of professionals, and it added an unusual touch to the wedding. Guests, one by one, took guns and shot at targets, experiencing excitement and pleasure. Some men gathered in groups to compete in marksmanship. Michael, with a glass of wine in his hand, strolled leisurely past the shooters, giving them advice and encouragement. Alexis approached him more often, as if she needed to say something or clarify something. They exchanged short remarks, and every time Michael said something in her ear, she responded with a slight smile. Clara, standing on a small dais with a glass of champagne, watched the scene. She watched as Michael and Alexis became more and more intimate, their conversations becoming more and more personal. It was beginning to worry her more and more, but she didn't want to stir up suspicion just yet. Today was too important a day to spoil it with her thoughts. Toward evening, the festivities became even more relaxed. Under the influence of alcohol, the guests began to relax, laughing louder, dancing with more passion. Michael, too, had drunk more than he had planned. He was now looking at Alexis openly, not bothering to hide his gaze. Alexis seemed relaxed, too, her smile growing wider and her touch on Michael more confident. At some point, The two of them disappeared from the guests' sight. No one paid attention except Clara, who noticed Michael and Alexis heading toward a secluded part of the garden. She watched as they stopped at an archway where there were no guests, and began talking to each other. Clara watched them from a distance, but even in this scene, there was nothing directly compromising. Only a slight, almost invisible to an outsider, tension that made her feel uneasy again. However, Clara continued to smile and hold herself with calmness. She tried not to give in to her thoughts, knowing it could ruin the harmony of the day. Everything was going according to plan. The wedding was luxurious. All the guests were happy. But the closer it got to nightfall, the more often Michael and Alexis disappeared from sight. Each time they returned together or alone, but it was beginning to draw attention. Guests flocked to the shooting range again. The shooting range was one of the main entertainment of the evening. Many of the men were competing eagerly to see who could hit the target better, and it created a continuous background noise of shots, laughter, and shouts of approval. Clara watched from a safe distance, not participating but watching the guests having fun. She saw Michael encouraging the gunman, joking and laughing. Alexis, standing nearby, held her wine glass and watched with a smile. By the end of the evening, the alcohol had begun to affect not only the guests' behavior, but also their perceptions. Michael and Alexis weren't just flirting. Their movements and gestures were becoming more and more explicit, and although most of the guests were too absorbed in their own amusement, Clara could no longer ignore what was happening. She saw Alexis step too close to Michael, their bodies touching for a moment, and it was no longer like the usual exchange of pleasantries. Clara felt her heart clench with anxiety. Meanwhile, the music in the garden was getting louder and louder, and the guests continued to dance and laugh. Everyone around them looked happy and contented, and the festive atmosphere continued to reign over the entire estate. The shooting range in the backyard was also full of guests who were competing in shooting, creating a continuous buzz of gunfire. Michael and Alexis, increasingly disappearing from view, seemed too busy with each other. They were now barely concealing their gazes and touches, though they tried to do so discreetly to the others. Alexis, still smiling and relaxed, was taking more and more liberties, as if she'd forgotten she was a married woman. At that moment, Clara felt her anxiety begin to turn to quiet rage. But despite the growing tension inside, she continued to remain calm outwardly. Everything around her seemed perfect, and no one but her noticed this growing tension. Night had fallen, illuminating the estate with the soft light of the lanterns along the paths. The feast was reaching its climax. The guests, intoxicated by the fresh air and wine, continued to laugh and have fun. Jazz melodies were still coming from the banquet hall, where the staunchest participants of the party were dancing. The waiters were removing empty glasses and carefully replenishing the food on the tables. But the general feeling of festivity was beginning to fade. The evening was drawing to a close. Clara stealthily walked away from the tables, feeling her heart beating harder and harder. Her thoughts grew more and more anxious with each step, as if some dark cloud was hanging over her mind. She walked along the hallway leading to the more private rooms of the manor, and suddenly she heard laughter and muffled voices. It was Michael and Alexis. Instinctively, Clara froze. She walked toward the door from which the sounds were coming. It was a small room away from the main stream of guests. Her heart pounded faster and faster as she stepped closer to the door. Her palms were sweating, and her breathing became ragged. She didn't want to believe her ears. Deep down, she hoped it was just another trifle, that her suspicions were unfounded. But what she saw when she opened the door turned her worst fears into reality. Michael stood half undressed, shirt unbuttoned, pants down, Alexis on the table with her dress pulled up, her hair spread across her shoulders, her laughter still audible but now echoing eerily in Clara's head. They were unaware of her presence, completely absorbed in each other. It wasn't just flirting, it wasn't just innocent touching. Clara caught them in the midst of passion. Her heart thundered in her chest, echoing in her ears. At that moment her mind was filled with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them came out. She didn't make a sound, even though the pain of betrayal was tearing her apart. Michael, her husband, had betrayed her in the worst possible way, right in their own home, right on their son's wedding day. Clara couldn't stay there much longer. She stepped back, slowly, carefully, as if afraid to give away her presence. Her legs seemed to refuse to move, but she managed to walk out of the room without attracting attention. Her world was falling apart, but it was invisible from the outside. None of the guests saw what was going on in the back of the house. Everyone continued to enjoy the fun. As Clara stepped out into the cool night, she felt a wave of anger flood her. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was a cold, shattering rage. For the first time in years, she felt utterly powerless, but at the same time, a determination began to build inside her. She knew she wouldn't make a scene now. She wouldn't scream or throw herself into a fight. It all seemed too trivial and meaningless compared to what she was feeling. Clara moved automatically, as if her body was guided by instinct rather than consciousness. There was a quiet, cold voice in her head that repeated only one thing: "You must punish them." She knew what to do. When she returned to where the guests were enjoying the shooting gallery, Clara saw Michael and Alexis re-emerge into the light as if nothing had happened. They were laughing, pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had happened between them. The guests didn't notice anything either. They were all too caught up in the fun and the alcohol. Clara approached the group that was standing by the table with guns to shoot. The men were discussing their hits on the targets with excitement, and the guns were lying neatly on the table, waiting for the next shooters. This was her decision. As the rumble of gunshots mingled with the laughter of the guests, as everyone was engrossed in their entertainment, Clara realized that it was here, amidst this noise, that she would be able to accomplish what she had planned. Clara knew that the bullets for the guns in the shooting gallery were the same, and that gave her confidence. No one would be able to tell at a glance who fired the shot. And the fingerprints on the guns? All the guests would have them too, since many of them had already picked up a gun. She felt a coolness and clarity of thought that she hadn't had half an hour ago. Now she knew what she had to do. She walked over to the weapons table and silently picked up one of the guns. Her movements were precise and confident. No one paid any attention to her. Everyone around them continued to laugh and enjoy the evening's festivities. Clara looked around and saw Michael and Alexis standing a little further away, discussing something with the guests. They didn't even realize that they had become her targets. Taking a few steps back, Clara took aim. Her heart beat slowly and calmly, as if this wasn't the first time she'd done this. The noise of gunfire all around, laughter and music drowned out her shots. Michael and Alexis's bullet wounds blended in with the general gunfire, and no one paid attention. They both fell almost simultaneously, their bodies collapsing to the ground like dolls bereft of life. It was so quick and sudden that even their last moments went unnoticed by those around them. Clara calmly placed the gun back on the table, blending in with the crowd. No one had seen what had happened, and no one could figure out who had fired. Her heart was beating with a steady certainty now, and there was a strange silence in her head. She had accomplished her revenge, and no one outside noticed. The festivities continued for a while longer, until the first guests began to notice that something was amiss. Alexis and Michael were lying on the ground, and those who saw their bodies at first thought it was a prank or a joke. But as they got closer, it was clear that this was no joke. There was silence in the manor. The first scream tore through the evening air, and the guests began to scurry toward the scene. Some tried to bring them to their senses, some called for help. But it was all in vain. They were already dead. The morning after the wedding came cold and gray. The whole Howell house, which had been ablaze with the lights and sounds of merriment yesterday, now looked gloomy and deserted. In the backyard, where hours ago they'd been shooting targets and drinking champagne, the remains of holiday decorations lay strewn about, and only silence disturbed the stillness of the estate. Michael and Alexis's bodies had already been removed, but the spot where they'd fallen remained fenced off with yellow police tape. Several detectives surveyed the area, trying to gather any evidence that might shed some light on what had happened. On the one hand, it looked like an accident. Shooting range, alcohol, lots of people. It looked like someone could have accidentally shot someone. But seasoned detective Samuel Kane sensed there was more to it than that. Kane stood a little ways away, scrutinizing the crime scene. His eyes moved quickly from one object to another, and his face read deep concentration. He'd been a detective for years, and his instincts rarely failed him. There was something wrong with this story. Too much of it seemed staged, and the people around him were acting too calm for such a tragedy. His partner, Detective Jennifer West, young but confident, stood beside him. She watched silently as their colleagues interviewed the guests, one by one recording their statements. But despite their efforts, none of them could give a clear answer as to what had happened. "It's all too clean," Kane finally said, summarizing the first results of the examination. "The guns were on the table with the fingerprints of everyone at the wedding. The bullets are identical, the shots mixed in with the general gunfire. There's nothing to hold on to." "Do you think it's an accident?" West asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Kane shook his head thoughtfully. "No, it doesn't look like an accident. There were too many people here and no one noticed anything. Too convenient. Like someone had thought it all out in advance." He looked at his young partner. "Do we have a motive?" "Just rumors so far. Some of the guests say that Michael was flirting with the bride. But that's just talk. No one has seen anything concrete." Kane frowned. These rumors could be important. If Michael really was flirting with Alexis, it could explain a lot of things. He glanced around at the crowd gathered outside the house. Everyone looked confused and depressed. "Where's Clara Howell?" he asked suddenly, remembering that he hadn't seen the dead man's wife all morning. "She's inside with the relatives. They're interviewing her right now," West replied. "But I think she's still in shock, very calm for a woman who lost her husband." Kane raised an eyebrow. "Come on, let's go see her." They headed inside the house, where Clara was sitting in one of the living rooms. She looked almost flawless, collected, demure, dressed in a severe black dress. The only thing that gave away her shock were her eyes, too blank and unmoving. She sat surrounded by her close relatives, who came up to her every now and then to ask how she was feeling. But Clara's answer was one-worded and unemotional. "Mrs. Howell," Kane said softly, approaching her, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I realize this is a difficult time, but we need to ask you some questions." Clara looked up at him and nodded faintly. She was silent, but her gaze was calm. "How are you feeling?" Kane began, trying to be tactful. "Yeah, I don't know," she answered after a short pause. "It all happened so suddenly." "Were you around when the shot was fired?" the detective asked. "No." Her voice was quiet but confident. "I was in the house. I didn't even realize anything had happened until I saw them." Her voice shook, and she was silent for a second, as if trying to collect her thoughts. Kane watched her reaction carefully, but he saw no signs of nervousness or anxiety. "Do you know if your husband and Alexis had any disagreements?" he asked next, changing his tone slightly. "Disagreements?" Clara asked, looking at him in surprise. "No. As far as I knew, they were getting along. We were all getting ready for the wedding, and everything seemed perfect." Kane nodded, but he thought there was something mechanical in her words. Too right. "We've heard from some of the guests that Michael may have flirted with the bride," he said cautiously, keeping his eyes on Clara. "Perhaps you have some thoughts on the matter?" Clara lifted her chin slightly and looked him straight in the eye. Her answer sounded unexpectedly calm. "I've heard the rumors, but they have no basis in fact. Michael was a good husband. We loved each other." Kane noted that she said it with a slight hesitation, but again, no obvious signs of nervousness. "Got it. Thank you, Mrs. Hole," he finished, feeling it was pointless to question her any further. "If you remember anything, let us know." As the detectives left the living room, West turned to her partner. "She's hiding something, it's obvious, but we don't have anything on her." "We only have suspicions," Kane replied. "But those suspicions aren't enough to convict her. She's too skillful at keeping herself under wraps." "What do we do?" West asked. "Observe her," said Kane. "Maybe she'll give herself away." Several days had passed since the murder. The whole estate had fallen into a strange silence. Family and loved ones mourned the loss of Michael and Alexis, but a general sense of helplessness and uncertainty hung in the air. Meanwhile, the detectives continued their work, methodically investigating anything that might help shed light on the tragedy. "We're going in circles," Kane said, setting aside the deposition papers. "It's all too blurry, and every time I think we've found something, it falls apart." "She knows we suspect her," West said, leaning on the table. Clara, I mean. She senses it, but she acts like she has nothing to fear. That's because we don't have anything concrete, Kane said dryly, and she realizes that. Nevertheless, the tension between the detectives and Clara was increasing. She continued to be a model of calmness, showing neither anxiety nor fear. Kane couldn't shake the feeling that this calmness was too artificial. He'd seen plenty of criminals in his career, and the ones who tried so hard to appear innocent were usually the ones to fear the most. They decided to revisit the case from a new angle, talking to the wedding guests about Clara's behavior on the day of the tragedy. Some claimed she seemed depressed, others recalled how she often avoided company and was silent most of the evening. But no one could say with certainty that she behaved suspiciously until after the murder. A key point for detectives was the testimony of one of the bridesmaids, who reported that Clara appeared to be unusually calm immediately after the bodies were discovered. She didn't scream, she didn't sob, the witness said. Just stood there and watched as if nothing was happening. I'd say she acted even too cold-blooded for someone who had just lost her husband. Those words settled in Kane's mind like a puzzle piece he'd been searching for a long time. It was important, but not enough to convict him. He needed something more than just testimony of strange behavior. He knew that Clara could have been hiding her emotions in shock, or it could have been that she was simply masterful at controlling herself. She's feeling something, Kane West said, as they discussed the results of the testimony again. The question is what exactly? We have no proof, West reminded him. If we try to press her with nothing, she'll figure us out. We're not going to press, Kane replied. We need something else. A confession, perhaps. A confession? She's too smart to confess, knowing there's nothing we can do. That's exactly why she might confess, Kane smiled. The paradox is that, knowing our helplessness, she has the luxury of telling the truth because neither she nor we have any real evidence. If we can't prove her guilt, she can be honest, knowing there's nothing we can do anyway. West looked at him incredulously, but there was a certain sense in her partner's words. You want her to deliberately tell us the truth, knowing we're powerless? Exactly, Kane confirmed. People, especially those who consider themselves untouchable, sometimes make that mistake. They confess when they think it's safe. It was a risky plan, but Kane felt there was no other option. They needed to get Clara to come clean and then decide what to do with the information. The next day, Kane and West arrived at the Whole estate again. Clara met them in the parlor, as restrained as before. She seemed even more relaxed than she had been the previous days, and her behavior made the detectives even more suspicious. Mrs. Hoole, we'd like to ask you a few more questions, Kane began, trying to speak as gently as possible so as not to make her feel wary. Of course, Clara nodded, sitting down on the couch. Her voice was still steady. We've learned a lot, but we still can't quite figure out what happened that night. Perhaps you could help us by telling us how you felt the moment you found out what happened, Kane continued. Clara looked at him for a long moment as if pondering his words. She knew that their interest was not merely professional. She was well aware that they suspected her, but had nothing to charge her with. What did I feel? She asked again. Honestly, not much. After what I saw. You saw? Kane stepped forward interestedly. Clara was silent for a moment, as if gathering her wits. Her gaze warmed slightly, as if she found something oddly comforting in this conversation. Yes, I did. I caught them. Her voice shook, but she quickly pulled herself together. Michael and Alexis, in the room, together. Kane and West looked at each other. Things were starting to make sense now. And what did you do? Kane asked quietly. Clara was silent again. She was well aware that she was now on edge, but she also knew that their options were limited. Even if she confessed, what would that change? I took the gun and killed them, she answered in an even voice, as if she were talking about something every day. Her eyes didn't waver. Kane froze. He hadn't expected such a direct answer. West was stunned, too. Do you realize this is a confession to murder? He asked cautiously. Clara nodded, her face remaining calm. Yes, I do, but what can you do about it? The room filled with silence. Clara's words hung in the air, plunging the detectives into a silent realization of what they had just heard. The confession, spoken with such ease, stunned Kane and West. It was like the blow they'd been expecting, but which still caught them off guard. "You have no evidence, no witnesses, just my word," Clara said, her face impenetrable, her eyes staring straight into Kane's eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. His experience and instincts told him that he was facing an adversary who knew exactly his limits. She was right. They really had no evidence other than her words. But her words, spoken in this context, could not be used in a court of law. A confession without physical evidence is just words. "Do you realize that this confession cannot be used against you if we have no evidence?" West asked cautiously, not taking her eyes off Clara. Clara nodded. "Yes, I understand. I know perfectly well that your hands are tied." Her voice was steady and calm. There didn't seem to be an ounce of fear inside her, only a cold certainty that she was right. Kane felt a contradictory feeling building up inside him. On the one hand, he wanted to grab her, make her answer for the murders. On the other hand, he realized that legally they were powerless. This confession was not evidence, and he couldn't use it to bring her to justice. "Why are you confessing?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. Clara looked at him, and her gaze softened a little. It was perhaps the first time she had ever allowed herself to show even a hint of emotion. "Because I don't care," she answered. "Michael betrayed me in the most humiliating way possible. On the day of our son's wedding, I couldn't bear it. I loved him, but that betrayal killed all love. When I saw them together..." She clenched her fists, her voice trembling slightly, but she quickly pulled herself together. It was the moment when everything fell apart. "I don't regret what I did. They deserve to die." The detectives listened to her in silence. There was no anger in those words, no hysteria, just calm, cold determination. It wasn't rage, but a realization of what she had done, and what she would have to live with now. "You have to understand that we can't just walk away and forget this happened," Kane began. "We will continue to investigate. We're going to look for evidence. And if we find it, you will be held accountable." Clara smiled, but it was empty and cold. "Do what you think is right," she said. "But you won't find anything. I've thought of everything. It's all too clean." Kane knew she was probably right. The bullets are the same, the guns are all in their hands, the prints are all mixed up. Clara killed them over the sound of gunfire at the party, and it was the perfect cover. She'd thought of everything down to the smallest detail. The only weakness in her plan was her own confession, but she knew that without proof, it wouldn't be enough. "You realize we're not stopping," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "Of course," Clara replied, rising from the couch. "But I won't hide either. If you find evidence, I will be punished. But until then, I'm free to go." She headed for the door, and the detectives watched her go in silence. When Clara left the room, Kane sighed heavily, ran a hand over his face, and slowly sat down on the couch. West was still standing motionless, contemplating what she'd heard. "Shit," she exhaled. "We're so close, yet so far away at the same time." Kane nodded. He knew how she felt. They had just gotten a murder confession, but there was nothing they could do about it. All they had to do was keep investigating, hoping that one day they would find the very thread they could pull to expose her for good. "We'll keep going," Kane finally said, raising his head. "She thinks she's got it under control, but we won't stop. She's committed murder, and we're not going to let it go." "But without proof," West began. "I know," Kane interrupted her, "but sometimes the truth finds a way to come out." It was starting to get dark outside. Clara entered the living room, where her relatives were waiting for her. They met her gaze with sympathy, but she hardly noticed their faces. Her thoughts were occupied with something else entirely. The confession made to the detectives had left her strangely calm. She knew that her words could do her no harm, and yet at the same time a strange sense of relief settled within her. It wasn't so much the guilt that was weighing her down as the need to hide. And now that she had told the truth, even if she couldn't be held accountable, she felt freer. Clara walked across the room, feeling the stares of those closest to her. None of them knew what had really happened. None of them guessed how cold the calculation of her actions had been. The moment she took the gun and pulled the trigger, she knew what she was doing. And now, realizing that the truth had been told and the consequences were far from assured, she felt her inner struggle complete. Kane stood beside the car, smoking a cigarette thoughtfully. Jennifer West leaned against the car door, crossing her arms. "We can't just leave it like this," she finally said. Kane was silent, watching the light clouds of smoke rising into the cold evening air. He knew she was right. This case wasn't one that could just be closed and forgotten about. He had the feeling that he was standing in front of a painting where all the elements were in place, but one final touch escaped his gaze. Something was bugging him. "Do you think she'll make a mistake?" West asked when Kane was silent for too long. Kane finally turned to her. "She's already made a mistake," he answered quietly. "She's confessed to us, and sooner or later something else will come out. We just have to be patient." He looked toward Howell Manor. The lights shone in the windows, and somewhere inside that house, Clara sat among her loved ones, surrounded by those who loved her. She thought she had everything under control, but Kane knew. Stories like this rarely end so smoothly. There's always something that can't be foreseen. "We'll find her mistake," he added quietly, dropping the cigarette to the ground and putting it out with the toe of his boot. "And then she won't be able to get away." Kane opened the car door and got behind the wheel. West followed him. They drove off, leaving behind the estate that seemed so calm and still. Clara watched from the window as the detective's car disappeared around the corner. Then she straightened the curtain and stepped away from the window, sinking into the twilight of the living room. It was quiet for her.